I knew something was wrong with the room before I understood what I was looking at. We had uncovered it 3 hours earlier, behind a sealed wall, during renovations beneath the east wing of the museum. The benches faced the wrong direction. Not slightly wrong. Not accidentally rotated during storage or renovation. They had been bolted deliberately into the floor, facing outward, toward the walls and observation windows, instead of the display cases themselves. I remember standing there with my flashlight in one hand, watching dust floating through the beam, trying to convince myself there had to be a practical explanation for it. There usually was. That was the danger of working in an old museum for too long. Strange things almost always turned out to be boring things. A hidden corridor led to outdated electrical systems. A locked room held asbestos. Missing floor plans turned out to be paperwork errors from the 70s. After enough years, your brain learns not to romanticize hidden spaces, which is why I trusted my instincts the moment I stepped into that room. Because nothing about it felt accidental. The museum sits on the older side of downtown, 6 stories above ground, and at least 3 below it, depending on which blueprint you trust. The public sees polished marble floors, curated lighting, restored galleries, carefully worded placards. They see the version designed for donors and tourists and school field trips. What they do not see are the maintenance tunnels behind the walls, the dead elevators, the abandoned climate control rooms, the old freight corridors bricked over during renovations. Nobody fully documented. Buildings like that become archaeological sites themselves. After long enough, I would know. I spent 15 years crawling through them. My job title was Facilities Renovation Coordinator, which mostly meant I was the person people called when a wall started leaking, or a contractor discovered wiring old enough to be displayed in a museum itself. I managed renovations, electrical upgrades, exhibit construction, flood mitigation, storage transitions, contractor access. Half project manager, half glorified basement mechanic. I knew the building better than most of the curators did. I knew which stairwell doors swelled in humid weather, which vents rattled before the heating system kicked on, which galleries carried sound strangely at night, which sections still had original stone behind the drywall. So when the measurements stopped making sense during the East Atrium renovation, I noticed immediately. There was empty space where there shouldn't have been. Not much at first. About 8 feet unaccounted for between the West Maintenance Corridor and Gallery 4B. Enough to look like a drafting error until we started opening sections of the wall and discovered older support structures hidden behind newer construction. Then, one of the contractors found the steel door. It was buried behind 2 generations of drywall and a layer of painted plywood that had probably not been disturbed since the late 80s. Reinforced frame, industrial hinges, standard locking hardware, no visible handle from the outside, and somehow, impossibly, the electrical conduit feeding into the wall still carried power. That bothered me more than the hidden door itself, because unused systems get disconnected eventually, especially in old buildings where nobody wants to pay unnecessary electrical costs. The fact that this room still had active power meant somebody, at some point, had intentionally maintained it. I requested archive access that afternoon. No floor plans mentioned the room. No renovation records acknowledged it. No exhibit files referenced it. But I did find something strange buried in a digitized facilities log from 1991. A single maintenance request approving continued electrical support for what was labeled only as Legacy Observational Archive. No description attached. No department listed. Just an authorization signature from someone who had retired before I started working there. I should have escalated it immediately. Instead, I opened the door. That sounds reckless now, but at the time it felt procedural. We found small, undocumented spaces all the time in older sections of the museum. Usually they contained outdated storage or forgotten equipment. Besides, if leadership already knew about it enough to keep the electricity active, I assumed there had to be records somewhere. The lock disengaged smoothly when maintenance overrode the power. No resistance. No rust. The door opened inward without a sound, and the room beyond looked operational, not abandoned, not preserved like a time capsule, more like it had been paused. Dust covered the floors, but lightly, as though the ventilation system had remained active. The exhibit lights still worked when I tested them. Velvet guide ropes divided the space into walking paths. Glass display cases stood intact beneath soft overhead illumination. It looked ready for visitors who had simply never arrived. But the layout was all wrong. The benches faced outward. The informational placards had been mounted backward, toward the walls, instead of toward guests. Reinforced observation windows lined one side of the room, though they overlooked nothing except darkness from inside. And the lighting illuminated where people would stand, not the objects. It made no sense. I walked the room slowly. The artifacts themselves were difficult to categorize, not because they were especially grotesque or dramatic. The opposite, actually. They looked old in the same unsettling way certain surgical tools look old. Functional beyond context. A polished obsidian mirror mounted inside a sealed frame. A stone figure with elongated proportions, and its eyes carefully removed. Fragments of masks made from materials I didn't recognize immediately. Thin metal instruments displayed without explanation. A collection of carved tablets covered in symbols from multiple cultures, layered over one another, as if different civilizations had tried to translate the same thing repeatedly. And everywhere, observation notes, typed reports, handwritten annotations, behavioral charts. Most referenced museum visitors, not by name, by subject number. Subject returned 3 times within same week. Subject displayed prolonged fixation response. Subject avoided reflections after initial contact. Subject reported recurring dreams involving depth. At first, it seemed like maybe it had been some kind of abandoned psychology exhibit. The museum experimented constantly in the 70s and 80s. Interactive curation, behavioral studies, audience engagement tracking. The language sounded clinical enough to fit. Then I noticed the viewing slits. Tiny apertures hidden within decorative molding along the walls. I leaned toward one and looked through. On the other side was Gallery 4B upstairs, open to the public. Visitors wandered through normally beneath soft gallery lights, completely unaware they were being watched from below. I checked another slit. Egyptian antiquities. Another. West Asian ceremonial objects. Another. Modern sculpture. The hidden room wasn't displaying artifacts. It was observing people observing artifacts. That realization sat in my stomach heavily enough that I finally called administration. I expected confusion. Instead, I got Dr. Miriam Vale. She arrived less than 20 minutes later. That alone felt strange. Senior administrators rarely moved quickly, unless donors or lawsuits were involved. Miriam served as Director of Collections Oversight, which meant she spent most of her time navigating wealthy donors, private collectors, and trustees who loved history most when it arrived behind glass with their name attached to it. She was older, maybe early 60s, though I had never been good at judging her age. Miriam always looked composed in a way that felt oddly detached from fatigue or stress. Perfect posture, precise speech, pale gray eyes that held eye contact slightly longer than comfort allowed. She stepped into the room, looked once toward the display cases, and asked, "Who else has seen this?" Not, "What is this?" Not, "How did you find it?" Who else has seen it? Every instinct I had started screaming at me then. I told her only the contractors and myself. She nodded once and closed the door behind her. For a long moment she simply stood there looking around the room with an expression I still struggle to describe. Not surprise. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. Like someone revisiting a hospital room they had hoped never to enter again. "The room needs to be resealed," she said quietly. That word landed harder than it should have. Resealed. Not documented. Not investigated. Resealed. I asked her what the room actually was. She took a long time answering. Finally, she said, "It was a restricted cognition exhibit." I laughed a little when she said it, because I genuinely thought she was joking. She didn't react. Then she started walking slowly through the room, avoiding direct eye contact with several of the artifacts as she passed them. "Most museums collect objects," she said. "This room collected responses." I remember the exact way she phrased it, because it sounded deeply wrong. Collected responses. As though human reactions were specimens. I asked who built the room. She ignored the question. Instead, she asked whether I had touched anything. I told her no. That was technically true. She nodded again and looked visibly relieved. "You'll need to avoid prolonged exposure," she said. That phrase bothered me almost as much as resealed. Prolonged exposure. Like radiation. Or infection. I asked her what the artifacts actually were. This time she hesitated. "Historical contact objects," she said carefully. A chill ran down my spine. Not ancient artifacts. Not ritual objects. Contact objects. Then she added something that has stayed with me ever since. Certain cultures interpreted observation as divinity. I asked what that meant. She looked toward the obsidian mirror across the room. "They noticed something noticing them." That should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it sounded rehearsed. Like a sentence she had said before. I wish I could explain exactly why Miriam unsettled me so deeply from that moment onward. It wasn't anything obvious. She never behaved theatrically. Never threatened me. Never hinted at conspiracies or hidden civilizations. But she spoke about human beings, the way an anthropologist describes isolated tribes. Detached, analytical, careful. When she finally left the room, she instructed me to lock it immediately and restrict contractor access pending containment review. Again, containment. Not preservation. Not security. containment. I should have followed instructions. Instead, I went back the next night alone. The room felt different after hours. Museums always do. During the day, they feel curated, intentional, full of controlled movement and low conversation. At night, they become architectural again. Vast, empty chambers humming softly, with ventilation systems and distant electrical noise. The hidden room felt awake, not alive, just attentive. I brought a flashlight and a maintenance keycard, though the exhibit lights still worked perfectly. Somehow that made things worse. The room looked too functional beneath soft amber illumination, too prepared. I started reading the observation journals properly then. The older entries sounded human enough. Academic, clinical, mostly from the 60s and 70s. Subject displayed, heightened emotional response to mask exhibit. Subject returned daily for 11 consecutive visits. Subject reported recurring dreams after exposure. But the newer entries changed gradually. The language became colder, detached in a subtly inhuman way. Subject exhibits increased social mimicry. Subject maintains eye contact beyond expected duration. Subject displays attachment to biological unit. Biological unit. Not spouse. Not child. Biological unit. I found entries dated less than 3 years earlier, meaning someone had continued operating the room long after it was supposedly abandoned. That was when I discovered the observation slits, facing downward instead of upward. One overlooked the employee cafeteria. Another faced the restoration wing. Another pointed directly into an administrative hallway. And one faced my office. I knew it immediately from the angle. The old drafting lamp near my desk. The shelving unit with warped binders. The coffee mug shaped like a subway car someone gave me years ago. I remember standing there frozen, with my eye pressed against the slit, while my office sat empty on the other side. Then I found the observation reports beside it. Subject maintains extended after-hours presence. Subject displays low social attachment. Subject exhibits preference for structural familiarity. Subject response profile remains stable. Most of the entries predated the renovation, some by years. I stopped breathing for a few seconds after reading that, because it meant someone had been watching me long before the room was uncovered, or something had. That was the first moment the story stopped feeling institutional and started feeling personal. I copied several reports and took them home that night. I barely slept. Not because I felt afraid exactly, because I couldn't stop thinking about the wording. Response profile, exposure, recognition. The language sounded less like curation and more like adaptation, as though the room wasn't studying art appreciation. It was studying humanity itself. I started researching Miriam after that. Not officially. Just archive searches, internal directories, old museum newsletters. She had worked there almost 30 years. Never married and no children. No public academic publications outside internal museum work. And photographs of her from the early 90s looked wrong. Not fake nor identical. Just strangely unchanged. I know how paranoid that sounds. Maybe stress distorted my perception. Maybe once an idea enters your head, your brain starts arranging evidence around it, like iron filings around a magnet. But the feeling persisted, especially after our next conversation. I confronted her privately in her office 2 days later. I told her I had found observation reports about me. She closed her eyes briefly when I said that. No expression of surprise, just resignation. Then she asked, "Did you spend long inside the room?" I asked her who had been watching me. She ignored the question again. Instead, she said something I still think about constantly. Observation alters behavior eventually, especially when the subject becomes aware. Subject. Not person. Subject. I asked her what the artifacts actually were. She stared at me silently for several seconds before answering. "They are interfaces," she said softly. I asked interfaces to what? She never answered directly. Instead, she said, "Ancient cultures describe them differently, depending on the century. Gods, angels, their watchers, their messengers, ancestors." She listed the words almost absently. Then she looked at me very carefully and added, "They noticed patterns in human cognition long before we did." Patterns. Not souls. Not morality. Cognition. That word chilled me more than anything else she'd said, because it sounded scientific, measured, as if humanity itself were something being analyzed from a distance. I asked her if the room had been used to study museum visitors. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. Then after a pause, "The room was built because the observation was already happening." That sentence has replayed in my head for months now. The observation was already happening, meaning the museum hadn't created the phenomenon. It had discovered it. That night, I went back one final time, not out of courage, compulsion, maybe, or the sick human need to look directly at something once you know it exists. The room felt colder than before. I noticed then that several artifacts seemed subtly altered from my earlier visits. Was the stone figure's head tilted slightly differently? Did the obsidian mirror reflect the room at a different angle? One of the masks appeared to be looking toward the observation slits now, instead of toward the wall. I was sure it hadn't been like that before. Probably memory distortion. Probably. Then I found the newest observation report. Fresh paper. Fresh ink. Dated that morning. Subject has become aware of observation. Continued exposure recommended. I heard movement behind me after reading that. Not footsteps. The soft creak of one of the benches shifting slightly beneath weight. When I turned around, the room looked unchanged, empty, silent. But for the first time, I had the overwhelming sensation that the artifacts were no longer passive objects. Not alive, not haunted, attentive, watching, evaluating. I left immediately after that. The room was sealed again within hours. Contractors arrived overnight under administrative supervision. Walls rebuilt. Corridors closed. Access records removed. Electrical feeds disconnected publicly, though I suspect not entirely. By the following week, no trace of the hidden exhibit remained on any floor plan. Officially, it never existed, but the museum feels different to me now. I notice visitors lingering too long in certain galleries, children waving toward empty corners, people returning day after day to stare silently into display cases, guests sketching symbols absent-mindedly in notebooks while sitting beneath particular exhibits. And sometimes, late at night, I catch staff members standing motionless in front of artifacts, long after closing, as if waiting for something to communicate back, Miriam still works there. Sometimes I see her watching visitors from upper balconies, with an expression that looks almost mournful. Other times, something else. I still don't know whether she was protecting people from the room, or protecting the room from people. Maybe there's no difference anymore. Last week, I found an envelope outside my office door with no name on it. Inside was a single observation report. No museum branding. No signature. Just typed text. Subject demonstrates increasing awareness. Subject continues returning. Despite distress response. Subject remains highly observable. And beneath that, one final line. Continued exposure recommended.
If this one got under your skin, there are more waiting. Subscribe to the leather-bound grimoire